Kia ora and koutou, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, the seventh in the Retail Reboot series, which is aiming to help retailers and your small businesses adjust and recover and thrive, particularly now as we move into level 1 and beyond. So no doubt many of you, like me, are relieved to finally get back to some semblance of normal. So my name is Sarah Dodds and I'm a lecturer in retailer marketing at Massey University. So if you've been following this webinar series, you would have seen my colleague Andrew Murphy, who has been really instrumental in organising these webinars. So thanks to Andrew. So today's webinar focuses on how to manage your employees. And of course, our employees are one of our most important assets. So we need to think about how can we manage all these changes through this next phase of recovery. So today we are very fortunate to have two renowned experts in the field. We have Amanda Douglas, a partner of Wynne Williams, who's an expert in employment law and health and safety. And we have Penny Holden, a performance consultant and leadership and communications specialist, who has extensive experience working with some large New Zealand and Australian businesses. So I warmly welcome you both, Amanda and Penny, and just really want to thank you for your time today and your willingness to support New Zealand businesses, helping them out, giving them some tips about how to move forward. But before we get on, just a few little housekeeping tips. If this is your first webinar, please keep your microphones on mute while the speakers are doing their thing. But don't worry if you can't do it, we'll manage it as well. Some of you posed some questions when you registered, so thank you very much. The speakers have seen those questions. But if you have any questions that pop up during the webinar series, then please just use the chat box, which you can bring up on your Zoom control panel. And the speakers will refer to them, but I'll also mop them up as well. If there are any questions that haven't been answered, then we can answer those in the Q&A session. Okay, so without further ado, I'd really like to introduce Amanda, who is our first speaker today, and over to you, Amanda.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm just going to share my screen while we're doing this. So today I'm talking about managing employees through a pandemic and beyond. Now, we've been through the period of lockdown. That has been a very difficult time, particularly in retail, and there's been a number of overlays, including the wage subsidy, which has assisted a lot of businesses to make their way through this period. And as we're moving into level 1, the problems have not gone away. As we move from each level, more and more businesses were able to get up and running legally as per government direction, and that has been a blessing for many, but what we've seen anecdotally is that many of those businesses have not been able to operate at previous pre-lockdown levels, and therefore there's been a number of measures that they have had to take in relation to their employees. So today I'll talk a little bit about some of those options so that you can manage your staff and really make sure that you're right-sizing your staff to the level of work or business that you have coming in, because we know that staff costs are a huge chunk of each business's operational costs. So the wage subsidy. The wage subsidy as we know it will be coming to an end shortly, if it hasn't already, for the businesses that applied for it. At the budget announcement, an extension to that wage subsidy was announced, and last week an amendment to the criteria for that wage subsidy extension was announced by the government. So when the budget announcement came through for the wage subsidy extension, it required a 50% loss of revenue. But what the amendment has been is to change it to 40% loss of revenue, which is quite significant for a number of businesses, because I've been talking to a lot who have said, oh, look, we're sitting around 40. I'm not sure if we're going to make it to 50 to be able to apply for that extension. So that's good news for many. So the extension is available through from the 10th of June to the 1st of September for that 8-week period. And as I said, it's this 40% loss of revenue is the criteria, and that's in the 40 days before the application is made and is compared to the equivalent period last year. Now, you need to wait for the current subsidy to end before making that application. The declarations are similar. So you will recall that these declarations are what governed a lot of the steps that employers took with their employees, primarily this one about retaining employees for the subsidy period. That was instrumental in delaying, and it wasn't eliminating, but it certainly delayed restructure proposals and redundancies from a lot of businesses, because they knew that they had signed these declarations saying that they would retain their staff for the duration of the subsidy period. So that same declaration applies in relation to the extension. And the other obligations of passing the subsidy on to the employee. That is what was instrumental in even where employees couldn't work, employers would stand their staff down for a period of the lockdown, for example, but pass on the wage subsidy. And the other requirement of trying your best to pay at least 80% of the employee's pay. Now, that's going to lead to a very interesting decision. And it's something that I think businesses need to be really careful of and to get some advice on, because if you apply for the wage subsidy, which will then require you to retain staff for the subsidy period, and here I'm talking about the extension for the further 8 weeks, then you won't be able to make any redundancies as per your declaration with the government. Now, it's sort of this unusual situation of a declaration back to the government, and then what are your obligations to your employees? And there is brewing in the wind a little bit of an argument which has not been tested through the courts because we haven't had time yet, that if an employer might be unreasonable if they qualify for the wage subsidy and don't apply for it so that they can make staff redundant. Now, there's all sorts of possible arguments, but there are good faith obligations that are owed by employers to employees, and a requirement to act as a reasonable employer could have done. So there's a whole bunch of issues there to be weighed up when deciding whether or not to apply for the wage subsidy extension, particularly where businesses are saying, we can't retain this number of staff in the long term. How do we deal with this? Now, some of the answer is in the more wider options that we have for managing staff. So what we saw through the lockdown, and as I said before, primarily driven by this obligation to retain staff, was that redundancies were really put on hold. And there were some businesses running redundancy processes, but on the whole, employers were looking at the other options. So a lot of the options during lockdown, etc., were standing staff down or suspending them or hibernating them or furloughing them, all really the same thing. The term suspension is not suspension in a disciplinary context, which is where we're used to hearing it, but came a lot out of the wording of pandemic or major event clauses in employment agreements. And certainly the ones that we drafted referred to the ability to suspend the services of staff for a period of time if impacted by major events, including a pandemic. Now, those clauses, just as an aside, are really, really useful, and I think their worth has really been proven through this process. So if people don't have those clauses, they should make sure that they do. So that's a lot of what was happening during lockdown, and also this concept of reducing hours and pay. Now, if you're wanting to look at that option, your best chance of success is if you have a corresponding reduction in hours worked to hours for which you paid. So there was a lot of talk and a lot of attempts actually to reduce staff's pay, say, to 80%, but require them to work 100% of the time. And that's really difficult to get across the line. And when I talk to people, employers who were wanting to do that option, I said, well, why are you wanting to do that? And when you drilled down into it, the reality was that they had less money coming in, and that was because they had less work, whatever they were doing. And so actually we could say staff can spend less hours doing that work and have a corresponding reduction. So there was a lot of knee-jerk reaction, but we have to give credit to the businesses who worked really hard during that time, because things changed every day or half day at the time. It was a really difficult time. So taking all of those options as a bundle, those are definitely options for moving forward. Hibernation is something that a lot of businesses are looking at, particularly those that are impacted anyway by winter months. So they're not terribly busy during winter. They are looking at hibernating their business and actually not starting up until the summer, or at least reassessing at that time. So that involves dealing with your staff and suspending them in the nice way, or standing them down for a period. So all of that requires a process, which I will get onto. And it's really important to remember you can't just go and do these things. So the starting point is that a business or employer cannot just make unilateral changes to the terms and conditions of employment, which will include what they're paid or when they work. There has been some misunderstandings from the wage subsidy, as I said before, this conflation between general principles of employment law and this wage subsidy declaration about this 80% of pay. The short answer is employment law has not gone out of the window. It still applies. The beauty of it all is that employment law processes are fairly flexible. There are some fundamental principles that you need to follow, but we can actually be really innovative about what we want to do with staff, and then we can apply the overlay of the employment law process to make it happen. But it is important to make sure that you are following a process. So what is that process? In general terms, it's around putting a written proposal to staff for any of those options that I've talked about. A proposal to staff backed up by genuine business reasons and details as to what is being proposed, why, and how that will impact on the staff. Now, when these things are looked at, which is often when an employee has raised a personal grievance and goes to the Employment Relations Authority, or the ERA, which is the first court, the court will look at whether it was substantially justified and whether it was procedurally justified. So what that means in plain English is, was there a good enough reason for the steps that were taken, and was the proper process followed? And so you could have a really good reason but not follow the right process, and the employee has the right to bring a personal grievance. So process is really important. I think it would be quite difficult in this environment for genuine steps in response to the COVID pandemic and lockdown and alert stages to say that there wasn't a genuine reason, provided that it all stacked up and you'd laid it out properly. So, but it is quite easy to get one step wrong in the process. So, and in actual fact, in the last couple of weeks, we have seen an influx in PGs being raised where businesses have tried to go it alone and do the process by themselves, and they just haven't done it right. And you mix that with an environment where employees have limited or much less chance of finding alternative employment at the moment, and it is a perfect storm for them raising a personal grievance. In circumstances where businesses can least afford to be paying out on to settle these things, which is what the end result usually is. So, so really, really important to address these things carefully. So the next step in the process would be to consult with staff, and that involves giving them time to read your written proposal. Everything you're going to be relying on should be in the proposal, chance to get some legal or other employment advice, and then for them to provide that feedback to you. And that can be in various different forms. Certainly when we've had our distancing requirements, a lot of those meetings have happened by video conference, for example. And so then the employer needs to genuinely consider that feedback before a decision is made. So there is case law there that in these types of processes where an employer has met with the employee, gone away for even half an hour and then come back and made the decision, that was not sufficient time to have properly considered the employee's response or feedback, and therefore it has been deemed to be predetermined. Now, predetermination is another aspect that is not permitted during these processes. It's based on the rules of natural justice, which is what underpins that. And so there can be some steps which are deemed to not comply. So you just need to be really careful, and that falls into some of the risks with the process. So before I move on to leave issues, it is really important to make sure that you are following a correct process, to get some advice and some guidance, and to ensure that you've got all of the information that you're relying on in the process. And you would apply that to all of those options that I've spoken about, whether you're wanting to reduce hours of work, and that might be even to remove some guaranteed hours that you've got there, just to give you some flexibility to match your staff working hours to actually the work that you've got there for people to do. Leave issues. There's been a lot of leave issues kicking around in relation to this pandemic period. A lot of people have asked whether they can require their staff to take annual leave. There is a provision in the Holidays Act that you can do that on 14 days' notice. The hook being that you need to have tried to reach agreement first. There was also commentary about whether the wage subsidy could be used for annual leave, and if it is agreed leave to be taken, then the wage subsidy can be utilised for that purpose. There's been a lot of, it's also important to remember that if staff have been on varied or reduced hours, then that is going to impact on the annual leave calculations. So usually you're paying the greater of the average weekly earnings, or in plain English, the average of the last 4 weeks or the average of the last 52 weeks. So those amounts are going to be affected if staff have been on less pay or hours within those periods. There's also been quite a bit of instances of staff not so much changing their minds about book travel, I suppose, but not being able to go and wanting to cancel leave. Now, as a starting point, there's no obligation for the employer to agree to cancel any pre-arranged leave, but it might be something that you're pretty pragmatic about. But I certainly know a lot of employers have been trying to get annual leave balances off their books, particularly when they can foresee that redundancies will be needed in the future, because of course on termination you need to pay out any accrued leave. Public holidays have been a little bit of a curly issue through particularly the lockdown. We had a few public holidays which were interesting, and we've just had one again recently. And look, certainly during lockdown, we need to assess for public holidays whether it's a normal working day for staff. And if they would have worked, if not for the lockdown, then our view was that that should have been treated as a normal working day for staff. If they were on the wage subsidy for that period, it may not have had any great impact. Essentially, they would have been getting 1/5 of the wage subsidy on any working day. So in practice, it probably didn't change things too much. But there were a lot of varieties of ways in which people were working. So that's an issue that's come up quite a bit. Likewise, right at the beginning around sick leave, it's important to remember that employees are entitled to sick leave when they're actually sick or caring for someone else specified, like their dependents, who is sick. But when we've had this concept of having to stay home in self-isolation, that's not technically covered by sick leave. Now that really led to the introduction of the scheme for leave introduced by the government, connected to the wage subsidy. They had it there and they took it away, and then they realised it was impacting essential services. So essentially there is the ability to apply for that leave if you've got someone in self-isolation, which as of today is probably unlikely. But looking forward, we're being warned that things could change and we may be going back into those situations. Now, you can't double dip. So if you've already applied for the wage subsidy for that staff member, you just pay the wage subsidy to them. But otherwise, if you hadn't applied for the wage subsidy, then that's something to be aware of. Health and safety has been at the forefront as well. It's interesting, we've brought the health of health and safety into the fore, and that's obviously been a massive focus for many businesses. We have our general obligations under the Health and Safety at Work Act, and we've now moved through to level 1, joyously, and so we've had a lot of battles, particularly in retail, of what are the requirements for signing into individual stores, for example. Thankfully, all of that has gone by the wayside. So people as individuals are encouraged to maintain a record of where they've been. But in terms of businesses, there's no requirement to contact trace by businesses and to retain that information. But what the government is asking businesses to do is to maintain the QR codes and ways to enable people visiting their business to be able to maintain their own records. The other aspect is around hygiene and sanitation. That remains really, and if you want to drill into all of the obligations, you're going to have to make sure that your workers are safe and that you have good hygiene practices in place for them and sanitisation. So where we're in retail or businesses with public contact, it makes sense to have in place good hygiene or sanitation measures so that you can protect your workers. And so that's a choice, but you still have this obligation to protect your workers, so it makes sense. So you don't need to be, doing that contact tracing, as I said, or limiting the size of people, size of groups of people, or actually maintaining or requiring physical distancing within stores, which was also another point of confusion or inconsistency perhaps. So this level 1 has been a bit of a relief in that respect. And then, of course, just making sure that you're communicating with your employees. Obviously, if they raise issues with you, then you need to be seen to be addressing them. And this is where we've had the issue right through lockdown, but it continues, of staff who are concerned about coming back to work. Now, hopefully that is dissipating as our number of COVID cases have gone down to 0, but there are people out there who are still nervous. So legally, if an issue is raised, then you need to be reasonable about it and at least be seen to be looking into it. It doesn't mean you have to change things if the request is not reasonable, but there are some compromises or steps that you may need to take in order to persuade them to come back to work. Many in the webinars I've been presenting have talked about how on earth do we get someone back to work. Penny will probably talk about some much nicer ways, but if those ways don't work, there are legal steps you can take where you give them a formal letter. Now, that doesn't have to be heavy-handed. In fact, it can be quite nice as far as formal letters go, where you're spelling out, well, we feel that we've made the workplace safe, you're raising these issues, we want to sit down with you and work through it. So there are some options if you're struggling with that, and some more informal steps don't work. So that's all I'm going to cover today. Key messages there are process. Don't go changing arrangements without going through a formal process, and make sure that you get some advice before you endeavour on the next steps that you might need to take, which heaps of businesses are doing at the moment.
Great, thank you so much, Amanda. It's certainly a minefield, I guess, at the moment in terms of the legalities around employment and health and safety. So, yeah, I think there was a question that was posed around how to manage teams, particularly when they now want to do flexible hours. So maybe some people who can and have been working from home want to sort of stay at home and do a bit of work. Or people who want to actually have flexible hours. What are the contractual issues around that?
Yeah, well, look, there are provisions in the legislation about flexible working requests. So once we've got to this point, and if someone's staying at home because they've got a family member who's immunocompromised, then that might not quite fall into the category. You might just accommodate that for as long as necessary, but where they just kind of quite like the situation, that is officially a flexible working request. So there are timeframes within which you've got to reply to that, and there's a number of matters that you can take into account. So applying those criteria ensures that you are fair to everybody, and you can decline it if there's going to be a decrease in quality of work, so things like that are a bit woolly, if it's going to have a negative effect on operations and things like that. Difficulty being, of course, that where people have been able to work remotely pretty successfully, then it's harder to decline that request on that basis. The other thing that a lot of employers are looking at the moment is developing a bit of a policy on flexible working and anticipating that they're going to have a lot of requests. So they want to be fair to everyone and have a one rule for everyone rather than ad hoc applications. So some that have been talking to us for help around that have been limiting the number of days, for example. So providing the flexibility. But what I'm hearing a lot too is we want that connection in the workplace, and we want people to be interacting. So they want to set it up so that people are in the workplace. And this, of course, applies where it's possible to work remotely. In many cases, it's not, and so you'd have a stronger argument for requiring them to come back to the workplace.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thanks,
Andrew.
Amanda. You mentioned making best efforts to pay 80% of the previous wage. Is there a test for what best efforts actually means? Because I know a number of employers are just paying the wage subsidy and making some sort of token effort to make that best effort.
Yeah, look, there's no test or assessment in terms of COVID, and that's the way that we normally get authority is where issues have gone to the court and been determined. But of course, that hasn't had a chance to happen yet. But we can look to what's happened outside of that, and there's not really much in employment law, but outside is you don't have to go to the brinks of disaster or use up every last penny before taking that step. So my advice to employers have been, make sure that you are seeking reprieve in other areas, so trying to save costs in other areas, that you have been to your bank, and record everything that you have done. I sort of envisage almost a little file on your computer that you can turn to if you need to later, where you just sort of like, oh yes, I did email the bank about this, well let's put that in there. And that you can look reasonably objectively to what was necessary to keep the business going. So there are many who could not pay 80%, and I think that will be okay. But what I think they need to make sure they've done is that they've got evidence and they've been through the steps of assessing that. And in a lot of cases, that also requires some forecasting or financial information.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Amanda. So, and now on to our next speaker, Penny Holden, who will really give some tips around, how to actually manage staff through these difficult times and beyond. So thanks, Penny. It's over to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you, Amanda. And I will respond a bit on the back of, there's a couple of questions Andrew's posed. The flexible working hours, I'll add something. There's also come up something about being scared of the future. So I'll go through that. And hopefully the way that I've taken this is to give you as many practical ideas as possible. The series is called Reboot, and working with a lot of companies recently, although there's so much uncertainty, we've actually looked at it as a time to reset. So the way that I've put this across is very much, hey, let's look at a bit of a reset. Now's a time, like Amanda said, you might redo policies. You might tighten some things up, but really I want to come at it from the angle of maintaining the people you want to maintain and looking at how you can actually reset that business. So let me just share the screen. Okay. Everybody can see that? Just good. Andrew's nodding, always helpful, fantastic. So the way I've put this together is as checklists. What I like to do is give people some reference material that you can look at afterwards. So I'm more than happy, please, to email me direct, and I'll email it back to you if you would like that, and I'll remind you at the end. Okay, so first of all, the first thing I've put together is to stop the world and actually have a look at you. There is a lot, as you will know, whether you're a small business, part of a big business, there's a lot around what I call leadership. And fundamentally, just like Amanda was saying, you're trying to manage a large number of different things, let alone be a good leader. But actually, all the way that you talk to your people and the foundations is around being a good leader. And when you are busy and you're stressed, some things can drop off. And if you drop off in the way you perhaps talk to people, what you don't want is, as Amanda was saying, you suddenly don't want a personal grievance. There's also to sit on top of the law. Amanda mentioned a lot about being reasonable and accommodating. So for me, I find there's two things. Ethically, do you want to be a good leader of your people and manage the business well? And I think that's how you get the best, as you will know. So that's just a checklist for you. One thing I really want to highlight and how it is affecting some people now is your view as a human being. So you're a human being, welcome, but suddenly you become a leader. And you manage, and I work with a lot of small biz as well as big biz. And the problem is, some people say, hey, I'm going to run it as a family. Yeah. Trouble is, I don't know about all of you, some families go a bit dysfunctional. And then you can fall into problems where you've given someone too much. And Amanda talked about this, what's fair and equitable. So one thing I want to highlight is being very aware how you treat your people and being equal with them. Now, by the way, if you are the owner and you've got managers below you, this is the information to also make sure they get. So one of the problems we found that can then escalate into legal problems is you like someone, therefore you happen to think, great. You happen to notice what they do well. You don't like someone else. So you happen, or they're just different. You don't spend as much time. And the reality is, what we know is people pick up those expectations and they actually become in line with how the leader sees them. So let me ask you a question and just think about it. How many of you have had managers or people above you who thought you were fantastic? Yeah, think about it. And therefore kind of gave you the opportunities, spent a bit more time giving you feedback, quality feedback. And then if I were to say how many of you have had bad managers, I usually get quite a lot of hands up, and you'll know the impact it's had on you. And I'm sure we've all had that. And what happens is you actually become less competent and less confident. Then if you've got, and I come back to the question Amanda answered at the end around flexible work practices, if then, you know, let's say I really like Andrew, hi Andrew, and I will give him a bit more flexibility. Let's say I don't like Sarah and I do Sarah, then I may just be a little bit less flexible. And then you're beginning to get into problems. So for me, I call this a reset. If you've got staff out there and employees out there, you now may need to take the time to look at how you're actually working with them. So I wanted to put that up front because it's a really good way to have a look at it. Now, my second checklist, and as I said, I'm not going to read through every bullet. These are for you to take away. The point I've put at the bottom is we want people to come to, if I said to you, what do you want? You want a person to come to work, you want them to do their work, do it well, and not cause you problems, and preferably be friendly and nice. That's what we want. It actually, I love this line where people go, well, they should have common sense. Common sense comes from experience, and often if someone sees the world differently to you, they don't have what you consider common sense. So for me, this checklist is an absolute essential, and it's really non-negotiable. And a lot of problems I'm sure that Amanda will face in her work comes by actually poor leadership or management. They haven't done what they should have done. And then it blows up, and then things get, I guess, go downhill. So for me, and I'm just going to go through this, you should be setting clear expectations early on. And this is a great time to do it. This is a great time to look at how's our business been? What's the culture like? How have we operated together? Make the expectations real. Use whatever language is right for your people. I mean, I've worked with hairdressers, I've worked with builders, I've worked with beauticians, I've worked with corporates. The language would be different, but actually the principle's the same. Checking in with people regularly to course correct. Now, a good manager, leader, will almost course correct as we go along and prevent anything small becoming bigger. Develop those positive relationships. Now, many of you may go, well, we're doing this. The reality is, in my experience, the busier you are, the more stressed you are, and a lot of, as we know, businesses are really struggling, the more this goes downhill and then escalates potentially into situations you don't want. Get to know people. I run my own business. If I go into a business and I look around and I go, yeah, like that person, like that, I don't like that person, but I've got to work with them. The first thing I'll do is find a way to build a relationship, because it will make my life easier and theirs. Giving feedback, and we're going to talk, what I'd like to cover shortly is a bit around the change. There was a question around managing people's fears. I'd like to address that shortly, but also how to have good, tough conversations. So giving that feedback and communicate. A lot of getting the best out of people at work, particularly if they are highly stressed, will come from you. So let's look a bit more at that. I just wanted to pop this in, because I found working with a number of employers, particularly smaller employers, that they don't have this set up, like maybe say big corporates or people with HR, people and culture representatives. I've put here, you could take those 3 items: conduct, the work, the tasks, and behavior. And if you work at each one and each one was 100%, you get high performance. Now, conduct is very much often what's in the contract, turning up to work, the number of hours, etc. The task is often their technical specialist, what they're there to do. And of course, they all overlap. Behavior can be one of the biggest problems in business and one of the hardest to address, and particularly in today's fragile workplace. Behaviors, inverted commas, or the way that people are behaving, has actually been escalated by stress, I guess. So my view is this: when you start with a new hire, or even now is a good time to do it, is to explore each of those and explore expectations. Set agree expectations for each, drive, monitor, give feedback, and by the way, celebrate, which I'll talk about. A simple way to talk about behavior, what a lot of the big businesses have are values, or behaviors we live by. that's great. If you got those, use them. If you don't, here's a real, what I call quick and dirty. I've worked with, people in manufacturing, above the line. So you kind of agree, look, we want above the line behavior, and that would be ownership, accountability, responsibility. And then you say, what does that look like for us? Or what does it look like for this team? And you get a bit of feedback and buy-in. You can also look at what below the line looks like and why we don't want it. Now, in a second, people get it. And what you're actually doing is setting people up to succeed, not catching them failing. Now, this is when you are busy, all you want is everybody to do everything. So they go off, they do it, brilliant. And then suddenly, Amanda doesn't do something I want. Sorry, Amanda. And so I come out and go, what are you doing? Now, she's just done 14 things well, but there's the 15th she didn't do. That knocks her confidence or makes her grumpy. She doesn't go the extra mile, which we desperately need. And now, with leaner business, we need everybody to do that extra mile. But why should she? So watching you do that balance of recognition, which is also harder if you don't like Amanda, and I do like you, Amanda, is something just to think about, okay? And I've put a bit of a line below there. Okay, I put this in as a nag because it's what I see out there, to avoid these common mistakes. And if you could do a quick read through that, I'm not going to ask how many of you do this, but these would be the top things that managers or business owners go around doing. The only thing I'd like to mention, just looking at it here, is that giving praise. My experience, and I'd be really keen to see if everybody felt this, I have been around New Zealand business probably 25, 30 years. It's quite reserved. We don't really talk about things. And then let's say someone like Andrew, now you're bad, Andrew, sorry. We get someone like Andrew who does something small and we kind of ignore it, or we just say, look, Andrew, don't do that, and we go off. And then it builds. And finally we go, but Andrew, I was not muted, I was being abusive. Then that could lead to personal grievance. It can lead to, I want to get rid of Andrew. And suddenly it's like, well, hang on, have you actually bothered to understand the problem, talk him through it? Have you helped him grow? And because we haven't done that, A, ethically, it's not fair on Andrew, and B, you're going to find yourself in hot water, which we don't want. So I've put crap sandwiches. They used to teach us a lot, and it's still on the internet. It was, and there's other words for it, but it was, hey, you're doing a great job, Sarah. What a shame you didn't do that first, but hey, you're doing a good job, Sarah. So it was positive, negative, positive. Now, don't do that. Why? Because the ego bunnies out there, and they will be out there, only hear the good stuff. So Sarah goes, yeah, I'm doing a great job. I'm fantastic. Whereas 99% of us hear the middle bit and go, what? And it makes you sound, we don't trust you. People know Kiwis are really good at seeing straight through anything that is sort of dressed up. So we've got to start being, I believe, in today's world, much more real in our conversation, but respectful. So I want to cover that a bit more. Now, a little bit about motivation. I find people ask me all the time. And at the moment, this matters a lot. When there is fear, everything's unsettled, tapping motivators where you can is a brilliant idea. Simply, if I say to people, why do you go to work? They'll say money, most of them. The reality is that's right. And if you were earning, I don't know, let me take a figure, 50K, you'll always want 55. When you got to 55, you'll always want 60. We all want money. The reality I find is they've got out of bed, hopefully showered, gone to work. If you were to say to them, do you want a really bad day today? Most would go no. There are a few who go out there to make life difficult. Few, not many. So that's what we're trying to tap into, is particularly if there's uncertainty, there's fear, there's less money, what makes your day feel good? Because the more people can latch on to that, the better performance you'll get, and the more that you'll find they pass that on to customers, which is what we want. Those are the questions, the conversations, the things to think about. And I've put here, this was from an Aberdeen group recently, what people wanted. I also, on the next page, have just given you a list of what I consider to be the top motivators for any of us. Achieving results, work relationships, the work itself, personal growth, responsibility, sorry, and I've just have to, recognition and purpose, thank you. If you quickly look at that and just for yourself go, out of those, which would be my top two? If I had to prioritize, most of us will value one or two of those above others. So mine is achieving results and personal growth. I mean, we all need all of them, but mine are those. How useful would it be for you to know as an employer? Because could I potentially be a bad employee if I didn't get personal growth? Yes. Would I get bored? Yes. Would I waste time on social media? Yes. Might I find I'm making more mistakes? Yes. So the reality is, and particularly now, let's say I was working with you, you might get me to refine a process that you've wanted to do for some time. Yeah. Why? Because that will keep my motivation up. It doesn't have to be, it can be business-like, but get thinking and talking. And I find most employees or employers haven't actually thought about this unless you've, like I say, you've got your sort of HR people and culture staff. And it's simple conversations. Show this list to an employee, get them to think, what's one thing you could do to improve something at work, Penny? Great, I've probably got some ideas. And whilst you're so busy trying to survive, why that's good is A, it gets me focused on the business, and it can be something that's going to help you future-proof, which is what we want. You've asked, somebody mentioned fears, and I've popped this in. It's, you know, I could bore you to death, and actually most people find it fascinating, a bit of neuroscience. Most of you will have heard of what I call the red brain, blue brain. So why I've put this up is I want you to know what happens to people under change and therefore what you can do, and with fears. We know this amygdala, the good old, you know, let's go back to the cave people. The amygdala is there to protect you. Everything in the world is positive in that. It's a reward or it's a threat. So saber-toothed tiger, big threat. Got it? Then we freeze, fight or flight. Now, you would know, even without seeing that diagram, everything that has been going on for people is about a threat. And it was the threat of death, the threat of then all the other things, threat of loss of income, actually loss of identity for lots of people in business. Why that matters is that is what is coming out through fear. All right. So when you feel fear, or when people are sharing fears, they're in that part of the brain. At the bottom, and I've put it there so you could go and research it if you're interested, is the SCARF model. Now, the SCARF model, New Zealander David Rock, simply says those 5 are the top 5 biggies in the threats or reward. So you've got status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Now, think about people's fears, think about the situation you're in, all of us, and a lot of that will keep circling. So status is about, do I have a job? Do I not? Even if you reassure, that's still going on. Certainty, actually, we're not certain. Nobody can be certain there won't be a second round. And Amanda was talking about that as well. So what you're doing is making sure as much as possible you tick what you can tick on that SCARF model, which I'm going to show you. I've put the change curve in. Most of us have heard of this change curve, but I just put it in. People go through it. They go through it at different stages. They may go backwards and forwards. And the tough one is number 3. You look at that one. And that's what people are bringing to you. So what I want to give you is a few ideas of how to help them through that. You do not need to be a psychologist, psychiatrist, but there are simple ways to help people go through that. So let's just pop through this because it is important. The first thing, give information as much as you can. Now, whether you support this government or not, Jacinda, she probably had a very good, someone like me, but it wasn't me because I would have done it and then I could have had loads of money, but someone who gave her key messages, how to do it. She did it incredibly well. I doubt I could have done it better, which is a shame because I always like to find a better way to do it. She gave as much information as she could. If you don't know, then tell people this. I don't know right now. We may know here. Be careful though what you promise. The way to deal with fears first is listen to fears and acknowledge, right? Often we cut them off or we give them solutions. I'll tell you what you should do. Actually, they need to have a bit of time just to be heard. Do you do that over and over and over? No. But I say it's better to listen to a person once, show you've listened, and then help them literally get on, which I've got below. Help to show what is real and what is fear. Acknowledge difficult times. State calmly what you can and can't do. So I come back to your flexible working, which Amanda talked to. The reality is, if you've got good workers, can you be flexible? And Amanda said they may have shown they can stay at work. I'd ask you to look at yourself. Is it your own fear that actually if I let them be flexible, they'll never do any work? Which used to be the old school of you should be stuck at your desk between sort of 8 and 4:30 or you're not really working. So that is something to think about. Can you accommodate, which is the language a lot of the law uses, and hopefully Amanda will support me. Can you accommodate someone, but at what cost to your business? Let me give you an example of, I was working with a business, and this was just prior to COVID. And the guy said to me, look, we've got a flexible working policy, and I agree absolutely with Amanda, you need to get those policies toned up now. And this guy's working from home. I said, okay, what's the problem? He said, well, he's not doing the work. Okay, can I ask him to not work from home? Right, and I need him to come in for meetings. So I said, okay, you've got a guy who's not delivering, who's not coming in when you want them to, and you're not addressing it. And he went, no. Okay, now, that sounds obvious, but sometimes we're so keen to follow certain policies. I said, the reality is they're employed, you have a contract to do a job. Are they doing the job to the quality you want? And are they delivering? If you are flexible, but this is a time we need you in, and there's good reason, then they're in. So I think it's about getting really clear in your head what is real, what is possible, and what isn't possible, and being aware of fairness, which the question had said earlier. Now, be aware of saying things under pressure that might be taken the wrong way. My view is say less than you need to, because under pressure, with that red brain in your own head, we start talking a lot and we're trying to make it better, and we may say things we didn't mean to. A top tip, be the holder of rumors. So what often happens is there's rumors everywhere. And then people go into corners, and I go into a corner with Sarah and go, oh, do you think that will happen? What do you think will happen? Do you think that will happen, Andrew? What do you reckon, Amanda? Ooh. And we actually get more and more anxious. Your job is to be the holder of rumors. So I've often said to managers, you keep the team meeting going, which you've dropped off, and particularly if everyone's unhappy, you go, I don't want a team meeting. You have that team meeting. You pull them together and you say, right, tell me what you've heard and I'll talk to it. So you actually hold those rumors. The last point is keep people doing things they know. It's soothing. It reminds them they're skilled. Get them doing stuff they've done. Don't let them spend all day talking and rumoring. It actually doesn't help. They think it helps, but it doesn't. Okay, just a few top tips for those challenging conversations, whatever they are. I think I've kind of covered this, but I just want to run through. Please plan what you say. Then be succinct and as clear as possible. Give all known information and always explain why. Be short, clear, empathetic. All right. So, and I wanted to show you the empathy reality. And I've said a value sentence. A value sentence is I have valued you. But if you pop over to the second box, it's a model called empathy reality. Now, the way you say it must be genuine. Sound terrible. I understand this isn't what you'd want, and I'm sorry. I know you had wanted. The reality is has to happen, and why. And if you have valued them, look, I have valued the effort you've put in. I've had people who they've been in a job 30 years, don't want to change. So the reality is, you're right, it was different. We have to change now. Let me support you. So if you feel that empathy helps them listen to you. Now, I've put and I'm not going to go through this, I really just popped it in because it's a key one that people ask me about. How to manage poor performance. And it's just, I call it, I've got 3 levels. I don't know what Amanda would say to that. My level 1 is small, friendly, not too heavy. Level 2, you do it properly and have a conversation. Level 3, you repeat level 2 and then be prepared to move on. I call this my 3 W's. So this is simply how to talk to a person and give them feedback. Just do it with a current example, but it must be factual. And this helps best practice under employment law. You are giving feedback factually. This morning, this happened. Then you listen, because if you listen well, you'll know the root cause, therefore you'll know the fix. The why is really important. Under the law, you're wanting to link it to a performance impact, so why it needs to change. And then you're sure that you come to some resolution, but always check for understanding and monitor. Okay, a lot of people give feedback and don't monitor it. 6 months later, they're back in the same position. And lastly, which is just a top tips for you, how to do it well. All right. Most people approach a conflict situation feeling they're going to have to fight. We don't need to. It's actually a conversation to help someone grow and improve. Okay. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm not sure if there's any more questions that have come in, Andrew.
Brilliant, thank you, Penny. Yeah, there's no more questions in, but you know, if people do have questions that they sort of go away and think about, then please feel free to either email Penny directly, or you can email Andrew at Massey, and we can certainly sort of get that. So,
sorry, Sarah.
Yes.
Sorry, Sarah. Just to say, a reminder to email me if they want those slides.
Yes, and if you want those slides with all those great checkpoints, because it's certainly something awesome to go back and have a look at, then yeah, please email Penny directly to get a copy of those slides. So thank you so much, Penny. That was great. It's so important to get those tips just to help manage staff. It's a very, very difficult time for managers and staff. I know my own son works at Columbus Cafe, and he sort of comes home exhausted because it's just so busy and everybody's stressed. So I know that you're managing huge amounts. So thank you so much. And to Amanda, just to get all that legal aspect. So it's really brilliant to kind of get the legal aspect and then some of those soft skills to be able to sort of manage yourselves and your employees through to the next, into the future, which is still a little bit unknown for all of us. So just to wrap up, thank you again for being here. And like me, you're probably looking forward to just getting on with some real life. And thanks again. We'll see you next week, hopefully, for webinar 8, where we'll be looking at restructuring tools for retailers and company law. So in this webinar, it'll help you navigate business restructuring, that things like changes to the law which have emerged as a result of the pandemic and the crisis. So we have Connor McKinney of McGrath Nicole and Stephen Lowe, a colleague of Amanda's from Win Williams, to talk about how you can navigate the best way forward for your business in this respect. So don't forget, the recordings of webinar 7 will join the previous webinars of Massey Business School on our Reboot page, and you can refer back to them all, and they're sort of in the public domain. So thanks again, everybody. Have a great day. See you next week.